The distant wail of a coyote pierced the twilight as Violet Ainsley stood alone on the edge of the makeshift dance floor. Tears streaming down her face, her carefully sewn blue calico dress now spotted with the evidence of her heartbreak. Around her, the townsfolk of Copper Creek twirled and laughed at the spring social of 1875, oblivious to her pain, or perhaps choosing to ignore the spectacle of yet another Ainsley family drama. No one approached her. No one dared. Not after what Gerald Whitman had just done, announcing his engagement to Penelope Davis in front of everyone, including Violet, who had been courting him for nearly a year. The humiliation burned hotter than the lanterns strung across the town square. Across the crowd, Colton Chase watched from beneath the brim of his worn Stetson. He'd ridden into town just 3 days prior, looking for ranch work after 2 years driving cattle from Texas to Kansas. At 30, he was tired of the endless trail, the dust, and the loneliness. Copper Creek, Colorado seemed as good a place as any to put down roots if such a thing were possible for a man with his past. "Poor Ainsley girl," muttered Tom Barlow, the livery owner who'd hired Colton temporarily. "Third time she's been jilted. Her pa's land is prime, but that temper of hers scares men off faster than a rattlesnake in a bedroll." Colton said nothing, but his eyes remained fixed on the young woman. There was something about her that pulled at him, perhaps the fierce dignity she maintained, even as tears fell freely down her cheeks. Without conscious thought, he found himself moving through the crowd toward her. Violet felt rather than saw someone approach. She stiffened, expecting more mockery or worse, pity. When she looked up into unfamiliar blue eyes, she was startled enough to momentarily forget her humiliation. "Madam," the stranger said, his voice low and gentle like he was calming a spooked horse, "seems to me a lady like yourself deserves better than to cry alone at a celebration." Before she could form a response, he had offered his handkerchief, a surprisingly clean one, and guided her gently away from the crowd's curious stares. His hand at her elbow was strong but respectful. "I don't know you," she managed, dabbing at her eyes. "Colton Chase, madam. New to town." He led her toward a quiet spot beneath a cottonwood tree. "And you're Miss Ainsley, I gather." "Violet," she said automatically, then caught herself. "How did you small town?" he said with a slight smile. "Word travels fast about the pretty daughter of the largest landowner around these parts." She bristled immediately. "If you're looking to court me for my father's land, Mr. Chase, you'd best join the line of disappointed suitors. I am no man's path to fortune." To her surprise, he laughed, a warm, genuine sound that caused several nearby dancers to glance their way. "Miss Ainsley, I've spent 12 years sleeping under the stars with nothing but my saddle for a pillow. I've got no designs on anyone's land but my own someday." His eyes, crinkled at the corners, held no deceit she could detect. "I just couldn't abide seeing a lady in distress without offering some comfort." Something in his straightforward manner disarmed her. Perhaps it was that he was a stranger, untainted by the years of gossip and history that colored every interaction in Copper Creek. "He proposed to her right in front of me," Violet found herself saying. "After promising just last Sunday he'd speak to my father this week." Colton nodded, leaning against the tree trunk. "Then he's a fool, Miss Ainsley, and you're well rid of him." "That's easy for you to say," she retorted, fresh tears threatening. "You're not the one who'll be whispered about for months. Poor Violet Ainsley can't keep a beau to save her life. They think I don't hear them." "Would you care to dance?" Colton asked suddenly. Violet stared at him. "What?" "Dance. With me. Right now." He straightened, holding out his hand. "Give them something else to whisper about." "I couldn't possibly." "You can," he said firmly. "And you should. Unless you'd rather give that Whitman fellow the satisfaction of ruining your evening completely." Violet looked toward the dance floor where Gerald was twirling his new fiancée, both of them laughing. Something hardened within her. "Very well, Mr. Chase," she said, placing her hand in his much larger one. "But I warn you, I'm not feeling particularly graceful tonight." "That makes two of us," he replied with a grin that transformed his weathered face. "I've danced more with campfire shadows than real women these past few years." As Colton led her back to the dance floor, Violet was acutely aware of the stares and whispers. But when he took her waist and began leading her in a somewhat rusty waltz, she found herself focusing on him instead of the crowd. He was taller than Gerald by several inches, with shoulders broadened by years of hard work. His face was tanned by the sun, with smile lines etched deeply around eyes the color of a summer sky. "Where are you from originally, Mr. Chase?" she asked, trying to distract herself from the intimacy of the dance. "Virginia, originally. Left when I was 18, right after the war ended." A shadow crossed his face. "Been moving west ever since." "And what brought you to Copper Creek?" He twirled her carefully before answering. "Heard there was good work to be had, cattle countries changing, railroads pushing closer. Thought maybe it was time to stop drifting." Violet studied him. There was more to his story, she was certain, but she recognized the look of a man who kept his secrets close. "And you?" he asked. "Have you always lived here?" "Born and raised," she replied. "My father came here in '55 before the gold rush brought the crowds, built our ranch from nothing." "You sound proud of him." "I am. He's a good man." She hesitated. "Demanding but fair." Colton nodded. The music was slowing, and with it their steps. When the final notes faded, he surprised her by keeping hold of her hand. "Miss Ainsley, would you allow me to escort you home this evening?" Violet blinked in surprise. "That's kind of you, but my father's wagon is. I believe your father left early. Overheard him telling the barkeep his back was troubling him again." Violet glanced around, confirming her father's absence. Charles Ainsley had indeed mentioned his back that morning, but she hadn't expected him to leave without her. "I have a horse," Colton continued. "It's not far to your ranch, is it?" 4 miles west, she said automatically, then caught herself. "Mr. Chase, this is highly improper. We've only just met, and I'm offering to see you safely home, nothing more." His voice was firm but gentle. "Unless you'd prefer to ask one of the fine gentlemen who have been watching you cry all evening." Put that way, her options seemed limited. Gerald had the family wagon, and the thought of asking for his help was unbearable. The other eligible men of Copper Creek had made themselves scarce after her public humiliation. "Very well," she said finally, "but we'll need to leave now before it gets fully dark." Colton nodded, offering his arm. As they walked away from the social, Violet was keenly aware of the curious stares following them. Her reputation, already damaged by Gerald's public rejection, would hardly be improved by leaving with a stranger. Yet somehow she found it difficult to care. His horse was a handsome sorrel gelding, well-muscled and alert. Colton checked the cinch, then turned to her with an apologetic look. "I'm afraid it's not the most ladylike way to travel in that dress." Violet gathered her skirts, eyeing the saddle. "I grew up on a ranch, Mr. Chase. I can ride." He smiled, a flash of white teeth in the gathering darkness, and helped her mount. When he swung up behind her, she realized the intimacy of their position, his chest against her back, his arms reaching around her to take the reins. She sat rigidly, grateful for the darkness hiding her blush. They rode in silence for a while, the sounds of the social fading behind them as they took the main road west out of town. The night was clear, stars emerging like diamonds scattered across black velvet. "Thank you," Violet said finally, "for the dance and everything else." "No need for thanks, Miss Ainsley." "Violet," she corrected, If we're to be sharing a saddle, you might as well use my given name. She felt rather than heard his soft chuckle. Violet, then, and I'm Colton. The road narrowed as it left town, forcing them to ride closer to the edge where shadows deepened among the scrub oak and pine. Something moved in the darkness, and the horse shied suddenly. Violet gasped as she began to slip, but Colton's arm instantly tightened around her waist, securing her against him. "Easy," he murmured, though whether to her or the horse she wasn't sure. Her heart raced as much from his touch as from the near fall. "What was that?" "Probably just a rabbit," he said, relaxing his grip slightly but not removing his arm entirely. "You all right?" "Yes," she managed, hyper-aware of his steady breathing against her back. "Just startled." They continued at a slower pace, Colton occasionally pointing out constellations above them. His knowledge of the stars impressed her. It was clear he'd spent many nights beneath them. "There's our turnoff," Violet said eventually, gesturing to a gate bearing the rocking a brand. Colton guided the horse through the gate, which Violet leaned down to unlatch and close behind them. The ranch house was visible in the distance, lamplight glowing in a single window. "Your father's still awake," Colton observed. "Probably waiting up for me," Violet sighed. "He'll have questions." "Would you prefer I didn't come to the door?" She considered this. "No. I'd rather introduce you properly than have him wonder." When they reached the house, Colton dismounted first, then reached up to help her down. His hands spanned her waist easily, and for a moment after her feet touched ground, they stood close enough that she could detect the faint scent of leather and tobacco that clung to him. The front door opened before either could step back, spilling light across the porch. Charles Ainsley stood framed in the doorway, his imposing figure unmistakable despite the shadows. "Violet." His deep voice carried across the yard. "That you?" "Yes, father," she called back, moving toward the house with Colton a respectful step behind. "I've brought a guest." Charles Ainsley was a big man, though he stooped slightly now with age and the back pain that had plagued him since a fall from a horse 3 winters past. His hair and beard, once as dark as Violet's, were now steel gray. His eyes, however, remained sharp as they assessed the stranger standing beside his daughter. "Mr. Ainsley," Colton said, removing his hat. "Colton Chase, sir. I hope you'll pardon the late hour. I offered to escort your daughter home when I noticed you'd had to leave the social early." Charles's gaze shifted to Violet, noting her reddened eyes even in the dim light. "That right, daughter?" "Yes," she said simply, chin lifting slightly. "Mr. Chase was kind enough to offer assistance when Gerald made other arrangements." Understanding crossed her father's weathered face. "I see." He stepped back, holding the door wider. "Best come in, then. Cold night to be standing on the porch." The Ainsley home was modest but comfortable, with sturdy furniture and bright quilts softening the rough-hewn walls. A fire burned low in the stone hearth, and the scent of coffee lingered in the air. "Coffee, Mr. Chase," Charles offered, gesturing toward the kitchen. "Least I can do for seeing my girl home safe." "That's kind of you, sir, if it's no trouble." Violet moved to the stove, grateful for something to do with her hands. As she poured 3 cups, she was aware of her father's scrutiny of their visitor. "You're new to these parts," Charles observed. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. Arrived Monday. Been taking odd jobs at the livery while I look for more permanent work." "Cowhand." "Yes, sir. 12 years on various outfits. Last few with the Bar T out of Fort Worth, driving herds up to Kansas." Charles nodded thoughtfully, accepting the coffee Violet handed him. "Good men, the Taylors. Worked a season with old man Taylor back in '58 before I came here." Colton's eyebrows rose slightly. "Small world, sir." "Indeed it is." Charles settled into his chair by the fire, gesturing for Colton to take the one opposite. What brings you to Colorado? Violet took a seat on the small sofa, observing the exchange with interest. Her father wasn't usually so conversational with strangers, especially not those who appeared unexpectedly with his daughter. Looking for a change, Colton replied, sipping his coffee. Trail drives are getting shorter with the railroads pushing west. Figured it was time to find something more settled. Ranch work can be just as uncertain, Charles warned. Especially these days with the big outfits buying up land and the winters getting harder. True enough, Colton acknowledged, but I'd rather face those uncertainties in one place than keep moving from season to season. Charles studied him over the rim of his cup. As it happens, I find myself short-handed, lost 2 men to the silver mines last month. Better pay, they figured, though I've my doubts about that lasting. Violet nearly dropped her cup. Her father, offering work to a stranger, and one who'd arrived with his daughter under questionable circumstances. I'd be interested, sir, Colton said carefully. Though I'd want to be clear it's on my merits, not other considerations. Charles's eyes crinkled slightly. You mean my daughter? Son, if I hired every man who showed interest in Violet, I'd have the largest ranch crew in 3 territories. Father, Violet protested, face heating. Just stating facts, girl. Charles turned back to Colton. $7 a week plus room and board in the bunkhouse. Works hard but fair. We'll try each other out for a month, see how it sits. That's generous, sir, thank you. Colton set down his empty cup and stood. I should be getting back to town. Got my things at the boarding house. Nonsense, Charles said. It's near midnight. Foreman's cabin is empty. He moved to town with his new bride last month. You can use it tonight. Head back for your belongings tomorrow. Violet stared at her father. This was unprecedented. Charles Ainsley was known for his caution with strangers, not for offering them jobs and housing within an hour of meeting them. I appreciate that, Mr. Ainsley, Colton said, clearly surprised as well. Charles stood, wincing slightly as he straightened his back. Violet, show Mr. Chase to the foreman's cabin. I'm for bed. He nodded to Colton. Breakfast at 5 if you want to sample what you're signing up for. I'll be there, sir. When her father had disappeared into his bedroom, Violet turned to Colton with raised eyebrows. Well, Mr. Chase, it seems you've made quite an impression. He looked genuinely puzzled. Wasn't my intention to seek employment this way. I believe you, she said, reaching for a lantern. My father's a good judge of character, always has been, except when it comes to my suitors, apparently. The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable, and Colton studied her face in the lamplight. That fellow at the social, he hurt you badly. It wasn't a question, but Violet answered anyway. It wasn't just Gerald. He's the third in 2 years to change his mind. She moved toward the door, unwilling to elaborate further. The foreman's cabin is this way. Outside, the night had grown colder, and Violet wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The foreman's cabin sat about 50 yards from the main house, close enough for convenience but far enough for privacy. It was a simple 1-room structure with a small porch. It's not much, she said, lighting the lamp inside and setting it on the table. But it's clean. Reynolds was particular about that, at least. The cabin was indeed neat, with a narrow bed against one wall, a small table with 2 chairs, a cast iron stove, and a chest of drawers. A faded rug covered part of the plank floor, and curtains that Violet recognized as her mother's handiwork hung at the single window. It's more than adequate, Colton said, looking around appreciatively. I've slept in far worse places. Violet moved to the stove, checking that there was kindling and matches. It gets cold at night, even in spring. You'll want a fire. I can manage, he said, setting his hat on the table. Thank you, Violet. The sound of her name in his deep voice made her pause, suddenly aware of their solitude. Propriety demanded she leave immediately, yet something kept her rooted to the spot. "Why did you help me tonight?" she asked abruptly. "You didn't know me, had no reason to involve yourself." Colton considered her question seriously. "I've been alone a long time," he said finally. "Know what it looks like when someone's hurting and thinks they're facing it alone." He shrugged slightly. Didn't seem right to just watch. His simple honesty caught her off guard. Most men in town would have given her some gallant line about a lady's distress, or worse, made it clear they thought her available now that Gerald had chosen another. "Well," she said, moving toward the door, "whatever your reasons, I'm grateful." "Violet," he called softly as she reached for the latch. When she turned, he was watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "For what it's worth, any man who'd humiliate you like that doesn't deserve a second thought." She managed a small smile. "Good night, Mr. Chase." "Colton," he corrected gently. "Colton," she echoed, then slipped out into the night, her mind and heart in a turmoil that had nothing to do with Gerald Whitman. The following morning dawned clear and cool, with the promise of warmth later in the day. Violet rose early, as was her habit, and was surprised to find Colton already at the kitchen table with her father when she entered. Both men had coffee cups before them, and her father was in the middle of explaining something about the spring calving. "Morning," she said, moving to the stove where she'd left dough rising overnight. "Miss Ainsley," Colton acknowledged with a nod, standing briefly as she entered. The formality made her smile, apparently their return to Mr. Chase and Miss Ainsley was mutual in the light of day. "I was just telling Chase here about our operation," Charles said. 500 head, mostly Herefords with some Angus mixed in. Good breeding stock. Father's won prizes at the territorial fair 3 years running," Violet said, working the dough with practiced hands. "Wouldn't have happened without Violet's eye for good stock," Charles added, surprising her. Her father rarely gave credit so openly. "Girl can spot a prime bull at 50 paces." Colton looked at her with new interest. "You work the ranch as well, then?" "Of course," she replied, perhaps more sharply than intended. "I can ride, rope, and brand with any man on this place. And cook better than all of them combined," Charles added with a rare smile. "We lost her mother 10 years back. Violet's managed the household since she was 16. Colton nodded, watching as she efficiently shaped the dough into biscuits. "Impressive." Something in his tone made her glance up. There was no condescension in his expression, only genuine admiration. It was unsettling, coming from a man who looked like him. "The men will be in soon," she said, changing the subject. "They'll be curious about you." "I'll introduce him at breakfast," Charles said. "He's riding out with Pedro and the others to check the north pasture today, get a feel for the place." Breakfast was a lively affair, with the 6 ranch hands crowding around the large table, eyeing the newcomer with undisguised curiosity. Pedro Martinez, the most senior hand who had taken over many of the foreman's duties, seemed particularly interested in Colton's experience with different cattle breeds. "These Herefords," he explained in his accented English, "they are good for the high country, yes, but sometimes stubborn." "Most good stock is," Colton replied, earning a laugh from the men. Violet moved around the table, refilling coffee cups and offering more biscuits. When she reached Colton, he looked up with a smile that seemed meant only for her. "Best biscuits I've had in years, Miss Ainsley," he said quietly. "High praise from a man who's eaten trail cook fare for so long," she returned, but couldn't help feeling pleased. After breakfast, the men dispersed to their duties. Violet began clearing the table, aware of Colton lingering by the door, hat in hand. "I'll be riding into town after the north pasture check," he said. "Need to settle my bill and collect my things from the boarding house." "I see," she replied, carrying dishes to the wash basin. "Will you be back for supper, if that's all right?" "Your father suggested I should be moved in before dark." She nodded, focusing on the dishes. "Supper's at 6. Don't be late or Pedro will claim your portion. He always does with newcomers." Colton laughed. "I'll remember that." He hesitated, then added, "About last night it's forgotten," she said quickly, not looking up. "Is it?" There was something in his voice that made her finally meet his gaze. "Because I haven't forgotten a moment of it." Before she could respond, Pedro called from outside, and Colton gave her a brief nod before settling his hat on his head and striding out the door. Violet stood motionless, hands submerged in soapy water, her heart beating too fast. What was happening to her? She just had her heart broken again, yet here she was, flustered by a man she'd known less than a day. A drifter, no less, the one her father had inexplicably taken a shine to. She shook her head, determined to focus on her chores. There was bread to bake, washing to do, and mending that wouldn't complete itself. She had no time for foolish daydreams about blue eyes and gentle hands. Yet throughout the day, she found her thoughts returning to Colton Chase, to the way he'd appeared beside her when she needed someone most, to the respect in his voice when he spoke to her father, to the warmth of his body behind hers as they rode through the darkness. By mid-afternoon, irritated with herself, Violet decided physical labor was the only cure for her distraction. She changed into her work-clothes sturdy trousers that scandalized the town ladies on the rare occasions they saw her in them, and headed to the barn to help Lucas, the youngest hand, with the tack repair. "Miss Violet," Lucas greeted her, looking up from the saddle he was oiling. At 19, he was the newest addition to the ranch crew before Colton. "Didn't expect to see you out here today. Needed some fresh air," she replied, picking up a bridle with broken reins. "How are you finding the new leather we got from Carson's shop?" "Good quality," Lucas said, then hesitated. "Miss Violet, can I ask you something, of course? That new fellow Chase, are you and he?" The young man flushed bright red. Violet stared at him. "Lucas Miller, what on earth are you asking? It's just—" "Well, the men are talking about how he brought you home last night and now he's got the foreman's cabin instead of a bunk with the rest of us, and you're all gossiping like old women at a quilting bee," she finished for him, annoyance clear in her voice. "Mr. Chase brought me home because Father had already left the social. Father offered him the foreman's cabin because it was nearly midnight and made no sense for him to ride back to town. And now Father's hired him because we're short-handed. That's all there is to it." Lucas nodded quickly. "Yes, madam." "That's what I figured." But Violet could tell he didn't entirely believe her, which only irritated her further. She worked in silence for a while, aggressively repairing the bridle. "He seems a good sort," Lucas ventured eventually. "Pedro says he knows his business with cattle." "I'm sure he does," Violet replied neutrally. "And he's not hard on the eyes, according to Maddie over at the Mercantile," Lucas added with a sly grin. "She was asking all about him when I picked up supplies this morning." Violet's hand stilled. "Was she?" "Oh, yes. Said he came in on Monday looking for work, and she ain't seen a man fill out a shirt like that since." "That's quite enough, Lucas," Violet interrupted, feeling unreasonably irritated. Maddie Collins was Copper Creek's most determined husband-hunter, with her sights set on any eligible bachelor who passed through town. "I'm sure Miss Collins has plenty of other matters to attend to besides ogling ranch hands." Lucas's grin widened. "Yes, madam, sure she does." Violet pointedly changed the subject to the upcoming cattle drive, but her mind remained stubbornly fixed on the image of Maddie Collins batting her eyelashes at Colton. It shouldn't matter to her in the slightest, yet somehow it did. The men returned from the North Pasture check, late in the afternoon. Violet, now back in a proper skirt and working on dinner preparations, heard them in the yard, Pedro's voice carrying as he gave instructions about the horses. She resisted the urge to go to the window and instead focused on chopping vegetables for the stew with more vigor than necessary. The back door opened, and she knew without turning that it was Colton. Something about the quality of his footsteps, perhaps, or the way the air in the room seemed to change. "Miss Ainsley," he said, removing his hat. "Hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," she replied, still not looking up. "Did you find the north pasture to your liking?" "It's good grazing land. Your father's done well with it." He moved further into the kitchen, and she could feel him watching her work. "I'm heading into town now. Anything you need while I'm there." Now she did look up. He stood just inside the door, trail dust clinging to his clothes, hat in hand. Despite the day's work, he looked more energized than tired. "No, thank you," she said. "Unless, did Father give you a list? Just ask me to check if Carson's got those fence staples in yet." He hesitated. "I was thinking I might stop by the telegraph office as well. Let my former boss know where I've landed." "Of course," she nodded. "You'll want to let people know where you are. Not many to tell, truth be told." His smile held a hint of something that might have been sadness. "But Taylor's been good to me. Deserves to know I found a place." The simple statement reminded her how little she knew about this man. "Will you be back for supper?" she asked again, remembering his earlier uncertainty. "Count on it," he said, his smile warming. "Wouldn't miss your cooking for anything." After he'd gone, Violet found herself wondering about Colton Chase's past. Where was his family? Had there been a wife somewhere along his travels? What ghosts haunted the shadows she sometimes glimpsed behind his eyes? Such questions were improper, she knew. A lady didn't pry into a gentleman's personal affairs, yet she couldn't help her curiosity, especially given how quickly her father had taken to him. Charles Ainsley was not a man who trusted easily or offered friendship without cause. The rest of the afternoon passed quickly with meal preparations and household chores. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Violet set the table and checked on her stew, which was simmering nicely. The ranch hands would be coming in soon, hungry after a day's work. She heard the sound of hoofbeats in the yard and moved to the window, expecting to see the men returning from their various tasks. Instead, she saw a wagon pulling up, the Whitman family wagon, with Gerald at the reins. Violet's stomach dropped. What was he doing here? Surely he didn't expect. No, that was impossible. Not after yesterday. She briefly considered hiding, pretending she wasn't home, but straightened her spine instead. She was Violet Ainsley, daughter of Charles Ainsley, and she would not cower in her own home because of Gerald Whitman's callousness. The knock came moments later. Taking a deep breath, Violet opened the door. Gerald stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable. He was handsome in a conventional way, with even features and neatly trimmed brown hair. Once, the sight of him had made her heart race. Now she felt nothing but a dull ache. "Violet," he began, "may I come in?" "I'm preparing supper," she replied coolly. "The men will be in soon. Please, just for a moment." Against her better judgment, she stepped back, allowing him entry. He moved past her into the front room, his familiar cologne bringing unwanted memories. "What do you want, Gerald?" she asked, remaining near the door. He turned to face her, his expression contrite. "I came to apologize. The way things happened yesterday, it wasn't how I intended to tell you." "You intended to tell me you were courting another woman while promising to speak to my father." The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. Gerald had the grace to look ashamed. "It wasn't like that. Not at first, Penelope and I. It happened suddenly. I didn't know how to tell you." So you decided a public announcement at the social was the kindest approach. That was Penelope's father's doing, Gerald protested. He arranged it without consulting me. I would never have hurt you like that intentionally, Violet. You must believe that. She studied him, this man she'd thought she might marry. Had she ever really known him at all? It doesn't matter now, she said finally. What's done is done. I wish you happiness with Penelope. Gerald took a step toward her. Violet, I still care for you. If things were different, but they're not, she interrupted. And I find I'm rather grateful for that fact. Something flashed in his eyes, wounded pride, perhaps. I heard you left the social with that drifter from Texas. Chase, isn't it? Moving on rather quickly, aren't you? The accusation stung, all the more because it was so unfair. Mr. Chase was kind enough to escort me home when I found myself abandoned. As for moving on, I believe you set that pace, Gerald, not I. Before he could respond, they heard the sound of horses outside. Through the window, Violet saw Colton dismounting from his sorrel, leading a pack-horse laden with his belongings. Her heart gave an unexpected leap. Gerald followed her gaze, his expression hardening. So it's true, your father's hired him. Yes, Violet said simply. You know nothing about him, Gerald said, lowering his voice. There are rumors about Chase in town, that he was involved in some trouble in Kansas, that he killed a man. Violet's eyes widened, but she quickly controlled her reaction. I don't put stock in town gossip, Gerald, neither should you. The front door opened and Colton stepped inside, stopping short when he saw Gerald. His expression remained neutral, but Violet noticed how his posture shifted slightly, becoming more alert. Mr. Whitman, he acknowledged with a nod. Chase, Gerald returned coldly. The tension in the room was palpable. Violet moved to break it. Mr. Chase, did you get everything from town? Yes, madam, Colton replied, his eyes not leaving Gerald. Carson had the fence staples. I've put them in the tool shed. Thank you, she turned to Gerald. If you'll excuse me, Mr. Whitman, I need to finish supper preparations. Gerald hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave her alone with Colton. Perhaps I could call again sometime, Violet, when you're less busy. I don't think that would be appropriate given your engagement, she replied firmly. Goodbye, Gerald. His jaw tightened, but he nodded stiffly. Good day, then. After he'd gone, Violet released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Colton watched her carefully. You all right? He asked quietly. Yes, she said, surprised to find it was true. Yes, I believe I am. Colton nodded, then gestured toward the door. I should get my things to the cabin. Of course. She hesitated, then added, Mr. Chase, in town did you hear any talk about yourself? His expression grew guarded. What kind of talk? Gerald mentioned rumors about trouble in Kansas. Colton was still for a long moment, his blue eyes unreadable. There was trouble, he said finally. Not of my making, but I was part of it. If you or your father want details, I won't hide anything. But I'd rather not have that conversation now, with supper waiting and the men due in. Violet nodded slowly. Later, then. Later, he agreed, and went back outside to retrieve his belongings. Alone in the kitchen, Violet found her hands were trembling slightly. What had she gotten herself into? A man she barely knew, with a mysterious past that apparently involved violence, was now living on their property. Her father had hired him on instinct, something Charles Ainsley rarely did. And she was drawn to him in a way she couldn't explain. The rational part of her mind warned caution. The rest of her remembered the gentleness in his eyes when he'd found her crying, the strength in his arms when he'd kept her from falling from his horse, the quiet dignity with which he'd faced Gerald's obvious disdain. By the time the ranch hands came in for supper, Violet had composed herself. She served the meal with her usual efficiency, aware of Colton watching her from his place at the table. The conversation flowed around them cattle prices, a wolf pack spotted near the eastern boundary, Lucas's comical attempt to break a particularly stubborn Mustang. After the meal, the men drifted outside to smoke and talk before turning in, leaving Violet, her father, and Colton at the table. "Good first day?" Charles asked, lighting his pipe. "Yes, sir," Colton replied. "You've got a well-run operation here." Charles nodded, satisfied. "Been building it for 20 years. Hope to leave it in good hands someday." His eyes flickered briefly to Violet. She recognized the opening for what it was her father's subtle way of bringing up the subject of her future. With no sons to inherit, Charles had always made it clear the ranch would be Violet's someday. It was part of what made her such an attractive marriage prospect, despite her reputation for a quick temper and independent ways. "Father," she said warningly. Charles ignored her. "Violet tells me Whitman came calling this afternoon." Colton's expression revealed nothing. "He was here when I returned from town." "After announcing his engagement to the Davis girl yesterday," Charles continued, puffing on his pipe. "Man's got nerve, I'll give him that." "He said he came to apologize," Violet said, stacking plates with more force than necessary. HMPH. Charles's snort conveyed his opinion of Gerald's apology. More likely came to make sure his backup plan was still available if things go south with the Davis girl. "Father." "Just saying what's plain to anyone with eyes, daughter." Charles turned to Colton. "You've been around. Tell me I'm wrong about men like Whitman." Colton hesitated, clearly uncomfortable being drawn into this discussion. "It's not my place to judge another man's intentions, sir." "Diplomatic answer," Charles observed with a slight smile. "But not what you really think, I'd wager." Colton met the older man's gaze steadily. "What I think is that your daughter deserves a man who values her for herself, not for what she brings to the table in terms of property or connections." The simple statement hung in the air between them. Violet felt a flush creeping up her neck, unable to look at either man. "Well said," Charles finally responded, nodding approval. "Well said indeed." He rose from the table, wincing as his back protested. "Think I'll turn in early. Long day tomorrow with the new calves needing branding." He looked at Colton. "You'll join the branding team?" "Wherever you need me, sir." "Good night, then." Charles patted Violet's shoulder as he passed. "Don't stay up too late, daughter." When he had gone, a silence fell between Violet and Colton. She busied herself with clearing the remaining dishes, acutely aware of his presence still at the table. "He's a good man, your father," Colton said at last. "Yes," she agreed, carrying dishes to the wash basin. "The best I know." "He thinks the world of you." Violet smiled slightly. "He's had to raise me alone since Mother died. It hasn't always been easy for him, having a daughter instead of a son to take over the ranch someday." "You seem more than capable of running things," Colton observed, rising to help her with the dishes, despite her protests. "I saw how you organized the men at supper, how they looked to you for approval. That's not something that happens by accident." She glanced at him, surprised by his perception. "Most men don't see it that way. They see a woman who should be content with homemaking and children, not cattle breeding and range management." "Most men are fools," he said simply, drying a plate she handed him. "Your Gerald, for instance." "He's not my Gerald," she corrected quickly. "And he never really was, apparently." Colton set down the plate and turned to face her fully. "His loss," he said quietly. "Clearly the man doesn't recognize quality when he sees it." The intensity in his blue eyes made her breath catch. They were standing close, too close for propriety, but she couldn't bring herself to step away. "You barely know me, Mr. Chase," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know enough," he replied. "I know you're strong enough to face downtown gossips with your head high. I know you're kind enough to feed a stranger and defend him against rumors. I know you're skilled enough to run this ranch with or without a husband." His voice softened. "And I know you're beautiful enough to make a man forget his own name when you smile." Violet's heart raced. No one had ever spoken to her this way with such direct honesty, without flattery or ulterior motive. "The rumors," she managed to say, "about Kansas, are they true?" His expression sobered. "Some of them likely. I did kill a man 3 years ago in Dodge City." He held her gaze steadily. "He was trying to rob the cattle sale proceeds from my trail boss. Shot the boss in the shoulder. I shot back. Self-defense," she said slowly. "The law saw it that way. But a dead man has friends, and some of them didn't agree with the law's assessment." His jaw tightened. "I decided it was time to move on, find new territory. And you've been moving ever since," he nodded. "Until now." The implications of those two words hung between them. Until now. As if Copper Creek, as if she represented something different, an end to wandering, perhaps. "It's getting late," she said finally, breaking the moment. "You must be tired after your first day." "Yes," he agreed, though his eyes said otherwise. "Thank you for supper. It was the best meal I've had in years." "You're welcome," she replied, stepping back to a more proper distance. "Breakfast is at 5 as always." He nodded, reaching for his hat. "Good night, Violet." "Good night, Colton." She watched from the window as he walked across the yard to the foreman's cabin, his figure silhouetted against the last glow of sunset. Only when his door closed behind him did she release the breath she'd been holding. What was happening to her? Just yesterday, she'd been devastated by Gerald's betrayal. Today, she could barely remember why she'd cared for him at all. Instead, her mind was filled with Colton Chase's words, his smile, the way he looked at her as if truly seeing her. It was madness. She barely knew him. Yet somehow, it felt as if she'd been waiting for him her entire life. Shaking off such fanciful thoughts, Violet finished cleaning the kitchen and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would be a busy day with the branding, and she needed her rest. There would be time enough to sort through these confusing feelings later. But as she lay in bed that night, sleep eluded her. Instead, she found herself staring at the ceiling, wondering if Colton was comfortable in the foreman's cabin, if he was thinking of her as she was thinking of him, if this strange connection between them was as real as it felt. Outside, a coyote called to the moon, its lonely cry echoing across the rangeland. Violet turned on her side, pulling the quilt higher. She would not lose her heart so quickly again. She would be cautious, sensible. Yet even as she made this vow to herself, she knew it might already be too late. The branding began at dawn. The spring calves, wobbly-legged and bawling, were separated from their mothers and driven into a holding pen. The men worked with practiced efficiency, Pedro and Lucas roping, 2 others wrestling the calves to the ground, Charles supervising the application of the red-hot branding iron bearing the rocking mark. Violet, dressed again in her practical work clothes, moved among them with water and occasional assistance. Most ranch wives and daughters would have remained in the house on branding day, but Violet had been part of this ritual since she was old enough to carry a bucket. Colton, she noticed, integrated seamlessly into the operation. He roped with skill and precision, handled the frightened calves with gentle firmness, and anticipated needs before they were voiced. By mid-morning, even Pedro, who was protective of his position as lead hand, was nodding approval at the newcomer's work. During a brief break, as the men gulped water and wiped sweat from their brows, Violet approached Colton with a fresh dipper. "You're good with the rope," she observed, handing him the water. "Thanks." He drank deeply, then returned the dipper. "Learned from some Comanche hands on my first outfit they could rope a jackrabbit at full gallop. Show-offs," she said with a small smile. He grinned. "Maybe. But effective teachers." He glanced toward the remaining calves. You've got good stock here, strong bloodlines. Father's been selective about his breeding bulls, she agreed. We sold 3 to outfits in Wyoming last year. I can see why. He squinted against the morning sun, studying her. You know, most women I've met would rather eat dirt than be out here on branding day. I'm not most women, she replied simply. His smile deepened. No, you certainly are not. The way he said it, as if her difference was something to be admired rather than corrected, warmed her more than the spring sunshine. Miss Violet, Lucas called from the pen. Your pa needs you. She turned to see her father beckoning from the branding fire. Duty calls, she said to Colton, then hurried to her father's side. Charles was examining a young heifer calf with concern. This one's got the scours, he said, gesturing to the calf's hind end. Need you to mix up that remedy of your mother's, the one with the charcoal and ginger. I'll fetch it, she nodded, understanding the urgency. Scour's severe diarrhea could kill a calf quickly if not treated. As she hurried toward the house, she heard rapid hoofbeats on the road. Turning, she saw a rider approaching at speed. Tom Barlow from the livery, his horse lathered with sweat. Ainsley, he called, reining in hard. Charles Ainsley. Her father straightened from the calf, frowning at the urgency in Tom's voice. Here, Barlow, what's the matter? Tom dismounted in a cloud of dust, his expression grave. Fire at the Collins place, started in their barn about an hour ago. Whole east side of their property's ablaze and the wind's pushing it this way, Violet's breath caught. The Collins ranch bordered their own to the east, less than 3 miles away. If the fire was spreading, how bad? Charles demanded, already moving toward the main barn where the firefighting equipment was stored. Bad, Tom confirmed grimly. Timothy's trying to organize men from town, but they need every hand they can get. Sheriff sent me to warn the ranches in this direction. Charles turned to his men now gathered around. Pedro, you and Lucas stay with the calves. Get them moved to the west pasture away from the eastern boundary. Rest of you with me. His gaze found Colton. Chase, you've seen range fires before. Yes, sir. Fought 2 big ones in the Panhandle. Good. You'll ride with me. Charles looked at Violet. Daughter, get the house ready. Wet down the roof and east side if you can reach. Bring in anything valuable from the outbuildings on that side. She nodded, already calculating what needed to be done. Range fires were a fact of life in cattle country, but that didn't make them any less terrifying. As the men rushed to prepare, Colton paused beside her. Be careful, he said quietly. If the wind shifts or the fire moves faster than expected, don't try to save buildings. Get yourself to safety. I know how to handle fire, she assured him. This isn't my first. I know you do, he said, his eyes serious. Just be careful anyway. Before she could respond, he had mounted his horse and was riding hard behind her father and the others, heading east toward the rising column of smoke now visible on the horizon. For the next 2 hours, Violet worked tirelessly. She filled buckets and barrels with water, soaked blankets, and spread them over the roofs of the most vulnerable outbuildings, and moved important documents and family heirlooms to the root cellar, which would be safest if the worst happened. Pedro and Lucas returned from moving the calves, their faces grim with the news that the fire had jumped the creek that marked the boundary between the Collins property and the Rocking A. It's moving fast, Pedro reported, helping her carry another barrel of water to the tool shed. The wind is not our friend today. Violet looked eastward where the smoke had thickened and darkened. Were her father and the others safe? Was Colton? We should clear a fire break, she decided, wiping sweat from her forehead. Between the east pasture and the main buildings. Pedro nodded approval. See, that is wise. Lucas and I will start now. They worked with picks and shovels, clearing a wide strip of earth down to bare dirt, removing anything that could burn. The smell of smoke grew stronger and ash began to drift down like gray snow. By late afternoon, Violet's arms ached and her lungs burned from the smoky air. But the fire break was complete, a 50-foot wide band of bare earth surrounding the main ranch buildings. If the fire reached this far, it would have to jump this gap to threaten the house and barns. She was refilling water barrels when she heard horses approaching from the east. Through the haze of smoke, she made out her father's distinctive figure, followed by several others. Relief flooded through her as she counted heads and found all present, including Colton, his face blackened with soot, but otherwise unharmed. "The fire's contained at the creek line," Charles announced as he dismounted stiffly, his face showing the strain of the day's battle. "Lost about 50 acres of east pasture, but the men from town helped us dig a break that's holding. Collins wasn't so lucky, barns gone, and most of his east fields." "Anyone hurt?" Violet asked, handing out dippers of water to the exhausted men. "Burns and smoke, nothing worse," her father replied. "Collins's youngest boy got caught in the barn for a bit, but Chase here pulled him out before any real damage was done." Violet's eyes flew to Colton, who was gulping water, seemingly unaware of her scrutiny. When he lowered the dipper, she saw the angry red mark across his right forearm, a burn he hadn't mentioned. "You're hurt," she said, moving to examine it. "It's nothing," he dismissed, but didn't pull away when she gently took his arm. "It needs cleaning and salve," she insisted. "Come inside." To her surprise, he acquiesced without further protest, following her into the house while the other men collapsed in the shade of the porch, gratefully accepting more water and the bread and cheese Violet had prepared earlier. In the kitchen, she directed Colton to sit at the table while she gathered her mother's medicine box. The burn was angry-looking but not severe, a line about 6 inches long where his sleeve had caught fire. "You were lucky," she commented, gently cleaning the wound with cool water. "The boy was luckier," he replied, watching her work. "Couldn't have been more than 10, frozen with fear in that burning barn. Reminded me of my brother at that age." Violet glanced up, surprised by this first mention of his family. "You have a brother," a shadow crossed his face. "Had. He died in the war. Petersburg near the end." "I'm sorry," she said softly, applying salve to the burn. "Long time ago now." His voice was matter-of-fact, but she sensed the old pain beneath it. "Was he older or younger?" "Younger. By 2 years." A faint smile touched his lips. "Wild as they come. Always in some scrape or other. I spent half my childhood pulling him out of trouble. Like pulling boys from burning barns," she suggested gently. His eyes met hers, something vulnerable in their blue depths. "Maybe so." She finished bandaging his arm in silence, aware of how intimate this moment felt, his arm under her hands, his face close enough that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, the fine lines at their corners. "Thank you," he said when she was done, but made no move to rise. "You're welcome." She began repacking the medicine box, needing something to do with her hands. "It was brave what you did." He shrugged his good shoulder. "Anyone would have done the same." "Not anyone," she disagreed. "Father says Collins's own hands wouldn't go in after the boy. Fear does strange things to people." He flexed his injured arm carefully. "Some freeze, some run. Can't really blame a man for either." "And some run into burning buildings," she observed, meeting his gaze. Something passed between them, then an understanding, a recognition. Before either could speak, the kitchen door opened and Charles entered, looking exhausted but relieved. "Sheriff just rode by," he announced. "Fire's officially contained. Might smolder for days, but the danger's past." "That's wonderful news," Violet said, rising. "You should rest, Father." I'll bring food to you and the men." Charles nodded gratefully, then noticed Colton's bandaged arm. "Chase, that burn giving you trouble?" "No, sir. Your daughter's a skilled nurse." "That she is," Charles agreed. "Her mother taught her well." He looked between them, a thoughtful expression crossing his weathered face. "When you're feeling up to it, Chase, I'd like your opinion on rebuilding the fence line along the creek. Tomorrow, perhaps, after things have cooled down." "Happy to help, sir." After Charles had gone to rest, Violet busied herself preparing a hearty meal for the firefighters. Colton insisted on helping despite his injury, slicing bread and carrying dishes as directed. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the rhythm of their movements falling into an easy pattern, as if they'd been doing this together for years rather than a single day. "Your father trusts your judgment," Colton observed as they arranged food on platters. "About the ranch operations, I mean. It's unusual." "Father's practical," she replied. "He knows I understand this land as well as he does, better in some ways since his back limits what he can do now. Still, most men wouldn't consider a daughter's opinion on fencing or breeding stock." She glanced at him. "And you? What do you think about women having opinions on such matters?" His smile was warm. "I think any man who ignores a smart woman's counsel is a fool, and I try not to be a fool when I can help it." Violet found herself smiling back, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the cooking fire. "You know," she said, arranging biscuits on a plate, "for a man who claims to have spent more time with cattle than people these past years, you have a remarkable way with words, Mr. Chase." "Only when properly inspired, Miss Ainsley," he returned, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than strictly proper. The moment was broken by Pedro calling from outside, asking if food was ready. Violet collected herself and began carrying platters out to the hungry men. The evening passed in a haze of exhaustion and relief. The men ate ravenously, then drifted off to their bunks or, in Colton's case, to the foreman's cabin. Violet, after ensuring her father was comfortable and the kitchen was tidied, finally allowed herself to retire to her own room. As she brushed out her long dark hair, she found herself thinking again of Colton, his quiet courage, his gentle hands, the way he looked at her as if truly seeing her. It was dangerous, this growing attachment. She'd been hurt too recently, too publicly, to risk her heart again so soon. Yet as she drifted toward sleep, her last thoughts were of blue eyes and a smile that seemed meant only for her. The following weeks brought a new rhythm to life at the Rocking A. The branding was completed, the burned pasture assessed and replanting begun, and the normal spring work of a cattle ranch continued unabated. Colton integrated himself into ranch operations with an ease that impressed even Pedro, who had initially been wary of the newcomer. His knowledge of cattle, his willingness to tackle the hardest jobs without complaint, and his respectful manner with the other hands quickly earned him a place of respect among the crew. Charles, too, clearly approved of his new hire. Increasingly, he sought Colton's opinion on ranch matters, sometimes even deferring to his judgment in ways he rarely did with the other men. For Violet, these weeks brought confusion and a growing awareness that frightened and exhilarated her in equal measure. She found herself looking forward to mealtimes when Colton would be present, arranging her daily tasks to intersect with his whenever possible, treasuring the brief conversations they shared in passing. They were careful, both of them, to maintain proper distance in front of others. But when alone checking fence lines together, or discussing cattle bloodlines in her father's study, or simply sharing a moment on the porch at day's end, there was an undeniable current between them that grew stronger with each passing day. It was during one such evening, nearly 3 weeks after the fire, that Violet found herself alone with Colton on the porch. Her father had retired early with his aching back, and the ranch hands were in town for their monthly night of recreation. The twilight was soft and golden, the air warm with the promise of summer. "You're quiet tonight," Colton observed, leaning against the porch railing opposite her chair. "Just thinking," she replied, her hands idle in her lap for once. She hesitated, then decided on honesty. "About how different things feel from a month ago, before the social before." She trailed off, not needing to complete the thought. "Before Gerald," he supplied. "Before me." "Yes," she met his gaze steadily. "Everything's changed so quickly. Do you regret it?" His voice was careful, neutral. "No," she said without hesitation. "That's what's strange. I thought I would. I thought I'd mourn what Gerald and I might have had. But now I can barely remember why I thought we suited." Colton nodded slowly. "Sometimes we want things because they seem right on the surface, not because they're right in truth." "And what's right in truth, Mr. Chase?" she asked softly. "For you, I mean." He was silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've been running a long time, Violet. From the war, from my brother's death, from what happened in Dodge City. Always moving, never staying long enough to put down roots. And now I find myself thinking about tomorrow and next month and next year, here." His voice dropped lower. "With you." Her heart raced at the simple declaration. "Colton, I know it's too soon," he interrupted gently. "You're still healing from betrayal. I'm still proving myself to your father to this place. I'm not asking for promises or commitments, just permission to hope." Violet stood, moving to the railing beside him, close enough that their arms nearly touched. "What if I told you I'm finding it difficult to remember a time before you were here?" His breath caught audibly. "I'd say that's a good beginning." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the sky. "There's a social next Saturday," Violet said finally. "In town, to raise money for those who lost property in the fire." "I'd heard," Colton nodded. "Would you consider escorting me?" She kept her eyes on the distant horizon, afraid to see his reaction. His hand found hers on the railing, covering it gently. "Nothing would honor me more," he said simply. When she finally looked at him, the tenderness in his eyes made words unnecessary. They stood together as darkness fell completely, hands touching on the weathered porch railing, the promise of something new and precious growing between them. The night of the social arrived clear and warm, with a full moon rising early in the eastern sky. Violet stood before her mirror, smoothing the skirt of her best dress, a deep blue that her mother had always said brought out the color of her eyes. She'd spent extra time with her hair, arranging the dark waves in a style more sophisticated than her usual practical braid. A knock at her door preceded her father's entry. Charles Ainsley paused in the doorway, his expression softening as he beheld his daughter. "You look like your mother," he said quietly. "Same look she had when she was courting." Violet flushed. "Father, I'm not, no." His eyebrows rose skeptically. "Then I'm an old fool who can't see what's right in front of him." She sighed, turning back to the mirror to adjust a hairpin. "It's complicated." "Love usually is," he replied, moving to stand behind her. "Your mother turned me down twice before she agreed to marry me, you know." "You've never told me that," Violet said, surprised. "Wasn't proud of it," Charles admitted. "I was too hot-headed in those days, too sure I knew best about everything. She was right to make me prove myself worthy of her." Violet met his eyes in the mirror. "And is that what I'm doing with Colton, making him prove himself?" Charles shook his head. "No, daughter. I think you're the one proving something to yourself, that you can trust your heart again after Whitman's betrayal." His perception startled her. She'd never discussed her feelings for Colton with her father, had believed she'd been discreet in her growing attachment. "He's a good man," Charles continued, resting his hands on her shoulders. "Better than Whitman ever was. I knew it the night he brought you home from the social." "How could you possibly have known that?" she asked, turning to face him directly. "The way he looked at you," Charles said simply. "Like a man who's found something precious and unexpected, something he'd protect with his life if necessary." He smiled slightly. "I recognized that look. Wore it myself when I met your mother." Violet felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "I'm afraid, Father." "Of what?" "Of being wrong again. Of trusting too quickly, too completely." Charles squeezed her shoulders gently. "That's the risk of loving, Violet. But from what I've seen of Chase these past weeks, he's a man who keeps his word. A man who faces danger rather than running from it. Those aren't qualities that change overnight." A sound from the yard drew their attention, the clip-clop of a horse's hooves. Colton had arrived to escort her to the social. "Your young man's here," Charles said, dropping a kiss on her forehead. "Go enjoy yourself. Just remember you're an Ainsley. You decide your own heart." With that, he left her to make her final preparations. Violet took a deep breath, checking her reflection one last time. Whatever happened tonight, she knew her father was right about one thing: the decision was hers to make, for good or ill. When she emerged onto the porch, Colton was waiting, hat in hand, dressed in what were clearly his best clothes: a dark coat, clean shirt, and polished boots. He'd trimmed his hair and beard, and as she descended the steps, the look in his eyes was exactly as her father had described a man beholding something precious. "You're beautiful," he said simply, offering his arm. "Thank you," she replied, feeling suddenly shy. "You look very handsome yourself." Charles appeared in the doorway. "Have her home at a reasonable hour, Chase." "Yes, sir," Colton nodded respectfully. "You're not attending." "Too old for dancing," Charles replied. "Besides, someone needs to keep an eye on things here. Pedro and the boys will all be in town tonight." After bidding her father goodbye, Violet allowed Colton to help her into the buckboard he'd borrowed for the occasion. The drive to town was pleasant, filled with easy conversation about ranch matters and gentle teasing about their expectations for the evening. "Fair warning," Violet said as they approached the outskirts of Copper Creek, "people will talk." "Let them," Colton replied with a shrug. "Unless, would you prefer I kept my distance at the social for propriety's sake?" She considered this, then shook her head firmly. "No. I'm tired of worrying what others think. Besides," she added with a small smile, "I'd hate to deprive Maddie Collins of the opportunity to glare daggers at me all evening." Colton laughed. "Miss Collins has made her interest rather obvious, hasn't she?" "Obvious?" Violet arched an eyebrow. "The woman practically swoons whenever you enter the mercantile. Lucas says she's been asking questions about you for weeks." "Well, she'll have her answer tonight," he said, his eyes warm on hers. "I'm spoken for if the lady in question will have me." The simple declaration made Violet's heart skip. Before she could respond, they had arrived at the town hall, where lanterns illuminated the crowd already gathering for the social. The event was well attended, with nearly everyone in Copper Creek and the surrounding ranches present. The hall had been decorated with spring flowers and colorful bunting, and a small band played lively tunes in one corner. Tables laden with food and drink lined one wall, while the center of the room had been cleared for dancing. As Colton helped Violet from the buckboard, she was acutely aware of curious eyes upon them. Word of Gerald's public jilting had spread far and wide, as had rumors of the handsome stranger now working at the Rocking A. Their arrival together would certainly set tongues wagging. "Ready?" Colton asked quietly, offering his arm. "Ready," she confirmed, slipping her hand into the crook of his elbow. They entered the hall together, and for a moment, Violet felt a wave of déjà vu, the social a month ago, her tears, the humiliation. But this time, she walked in with her head high, beside a man who looked at her as if she were the only woman in the room. Gerald was there, of course, with Penelope on his arm. When he saw Violet and Colton, his expression darkened momentarily before he smoothed it into careful neutrality. Penelope, however, made no attempt to hide her surprise and disapproval. "Ignore them," Colton murmured, guiding Violet toward the refreshment table. "Tonight isn't about them." "No," she agreed, smiling up at him. "It's not." They were soon joined by Tom Barlow and his wife, who engaged them in friendly conversation about the recovery efforts after the fire. Other acquaintances stopped by as well, some clearly curious about the nature of Violet's relationship with the newcomer. Others genuinely pleased to see her looking happy again. When the band struck up a waltz, Colton turned to her with a slight bow. "May I have this dance, Miss Ainsley?" "You may, Mr. Chase," she replied, placing her hand in his. As he led her onto the dance floor, Violet was aware of eyes following them, of whispers behind fans and hands. But when Colton took her in his arms and began to move with surprising grace to the music, everything else faded away. "You dance well for a cowboy," she observed, following his lead effortlessly. "My mother insisted," he replied with a smile. "Said no son of hers would stomp around a dance floor like a bull in a china shop." "I like her already," Violet laughed. "She would have liked you too," he said, his expression softening. "Strong, capable, not afraid to speak your mind, is she?" "Gone, yes, 5 years now, influenza." His steps never faltered as he spoke of this loss. "Father went during the war. Heart gave out after news of my brother." "I'm sorry," she said softly, "to lose so many." "It's the way of things," he replied, but without bitterness. "Makes you value what remains, who remains, all the more." Their eyes held, and Violet felt something shift between them, a deepening, a certainty that hadn't been there before. The waltz ended, but Colton kept hold of her hand as they left the dance floor. "Would you like some air?" he asked. "It's getting warm in here." She nodded, and he led her toward the side door that opened onto a small garden behind the town hall. The night air was indeed cooler, scented with lilacs from bushes planted along the garden path. A few other couples strolled nearby, but a bench beneath a flowering tree offered some privacy. "Better?" he asked as they sat. "Much," she agreed, enjoying the relative quiet after the noise of the hall. "It's a lovely night." "It is," he agreed, though his eyes were on her rather than the star-filled sky. After a moment he spoke again, his voice lower. "Violet, there's something I need to tell you." The seriousness in his tone made her heart quicken with apprehension. "What is it?" "I received a letter yesterday from an old friend in Dodge City." He hesitated, then continued. "The man who's been looking for me, the brother of the man I killed, he died last month. Typhoid." Violet processed this information slowly. "So the danger is past. No one's hunting you anymore. It seems that way." He looked down at their still joined hands. "I've been carrying that shadow for 3 years, looking over my shoulder, never staying in one place too long. Now—" He lifted his gaze to hers. "Now I'm free to decide where I belong, where I want to stay." The implication was clear in his eyes, in the gentle pressure of his fingers around hers. "And where is that?" she asked, hardly daring to breathe. "Here," he said simply. "With you if you'll have me." Time seemed to stop in that moment. All the doubts, the fears, the lingering wounds from Gerald's betrayal, they didn't disappear, but they diminished, becoming smaller than the certainty growing in her heart. "It's only been a month," she said, giving voice to the most rational of her concerns. "I know." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "And I'm not asking for everything at once. Just a beginning. A chance to court you properly with your father's blessing and in the light of day. No more pretending we're just ranch owner in hand when we both know it's more. The honesty of his words, the respect in his manner, asking rather than assuming, offering rather than demanding, moved her deeply. "Yes," she said finally, the word barely above a whisper. "I'd like that very much." The smile that illuminated his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, there in the garden with the lilacs scenting the air and the stars witnessing above. But he was too mindful of propriety, too respectful of her reputation, to take such a liberty in a public place. Instead, he lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Thank you," he said simply. They remained in the garden a while longer, talking of small things and large, his hopes for the future, her dreams for the ranch, the life they might build together if all went well. When they finally returned to the hall, Violet felt as though something fundamental had shifted within her, within them both. The remainder of the evening passed in a pleasant blur. They danced again, spoke with friends and neighbors, and even exchanged civil nods with Gerald and Penelope when their paths crossed. Maddie Collins did indeed glare from across the room, but Violet found she could only feel sympathy for the other woman. Maddie couldn't know what she had missed, the depth and quality of the man, whose arm Violet now held with quiet pride. As the social wound down, and they began the drive back to the rocking A comfortable silence fell between them. The night was beautiful, the road silver in the moonlight, and Violet felt a contentment she hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember. "I'll speak to your father tomorrow," Colton said as they approached the ranch, "about courting you formally." "He already knows," Violet replied with a small smile. "He all but gave his blessing before we left this evening." Colton glanced at her in surprise. "Did he now?" Said he recognized the way you look at me." She turned slightly to face him on the seat. "How do you look at me, Colton Chase?" Even in the moonlight, she could see color rise in his face. "Like a man who's found something he thought existed only in dreams," he admitted. "Like a man who can't quite believe his good fortune." Her heart swelled at his words. When the buckboard pulled up before the ranch house, she waited as he secured the horses, then took his offered hand to descend. They walked slowly to the porch, reluctant to end the evening. On the steps, she turned to face him. "Thank you for tonight, for everything." "The pleasure was entirely mine," he replied softly. This time, away from curious eyes and in the sanctuary of her home, she saw the question in his eyes as he looked at her lips. With a courage born of newfound certainty, she raised her face to his, a silent invitation. His kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if he feared she might change her mind. But when her hands came up to rest on his shoulders, he deepened the kiss, drawing her closer with a tenderness that made her heart ache. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Violet knew with absolute certainty that this was right, this man, this moment, this beginning. "Good night, Colton," she whispered. "Good night, Violet," he returned, his voice husky with emotion. "Sweet dreams." She watched from the doorway as he led the borrowed buckboard toward the barn, his figure straight and tall in the moonlight. Only when he had disappeared from view did she enter the house, closing the door on the night but not on the promise it had held. Inside, a lamp burned low in the front room and her father dozed in his chair by the cold hearth. He stirred as she entered, blinking away sleep. "Good time?" he asked, straightening. "The best," she replied honestly, moving to kiss his weathered cheek. "Thank you for understanding, Father." Charles patted her hand. "Nothing to understand, girl. A father wants his daughter happy. Chase makes you happy. Simple as that." As Violet prepared for bed that night, she reflected on her father's words. Simple as that. Perhaps love could be simple after all when it was right. Not without challenges or growth, but fundamentally uncomplicated in its certainty. She fell asleep with the memory of Colton's kiss still warming her, and for the first time in many nights, her dreams were peaceful and full of promise. The courtship of Violet Ainsley and Colton Chase progressed with a naturalness that surprised even them. In the weeks that followed the social, they settled into a rhythm that balanced propriety with their growing attachment. Charles insisted that Colton continue his duties as a ranch hand during the day, no special treatment just because you're courting my daughter. He declared but welcomed him to supper most evenings, and granted permission for Sunday afternoon rides and occasional trips to town together. The people of Copper Creek adjusted quickly to the new arrangement. There were some raised eyebrows at the speed with which Violet had apparently transferred her affections from Gerald to the newcomer, but these diminished as it became clear that this courtship was different, more measured, more genuine, marked by mutual respect rather than mere convenience. Gerald and Penelope married in a small ceremony at her parents' home. Violet sent a polite note of congratulations, but did not attend. When they departed for Denver, where Gerald had secured a position with Penelope's uncle's banking firm, Violet found she felt nothing but relief and a vague sense of having narrowly escaped a fate that would have made her deeply unhappy. By midsummer, the burned pasture at the eastern boundary had begun to recover, green shoots pushing through the blackened earth. The Collins family had rebuilt their barn with the help of neighbors, including the men of the Rocking A. Life had returned to its normal rhythms, with cattle to tend, crops to harvest, and the everyday business of the ranch to manage. Yet for Violet and Colton, nothing was quite the same as before. Each day brought new discoveries, his unexpected knowledge of poetry, learned from a dog-eared volume carried in his saddlebags for years, her talent for sketching, revealed when he found her drawing the mountains at sunset. Their shared love of thunderstorms, which they watched from the safety of the porch, counting seconds between lightning and thunder like children. It was during one such storm in late July that Colton finally spoke of their future in concrete terms. They sat on the porch swing, watching as lightning illuminated the distant peaks and thunder rolled across the valley. Charles had retired early, leaving them alone with the tempest. "I've been thinking," Colton said during a lull in the thunder, his voice nearly lost in the sound of rain pounding on the roof. "A dangerous pastime," Violet teased, nestled against his side with his arm around her shoulders. He smiled, but his eyes remained serious. "About us." "About what comes next," her heart quickened. "And what does come next in your thinking? Marriage," he said simply. "A life together. Here on the Rocking A if your father approves, or elsewhere if that's what you prefer." Though they had spoken around this subject before, hinted at it in 100 small ways, the direct statement still took her breath away. "Are you proposing, Colton Chase?" she asked, pulling back slightly to see his face better in the lamplight spilling from the window. "Not quite yet," he replied, his hand finding hers. "There are things to arrange first. I want to do this right, Violet. I want to be a partner to you in every sense, not just a hired hand who married the boss's daughter." She understood immediately. "You're worried about what people will say." "That you married me for the ranch." "Not worried about what they'll say," he corrected. "Worried about what you might come to believe, years from now, if I don't establish myself properly first." Violet considered this. It was true that Colton had arrived with little more than his horse and saddle, while she stood to inherit one of the largest ranches in the county. The imbalance didn't trouble her. She knew his character too well by now to doubt his motives, but she appreciated his concern for her future peace of mind. "What do you propose, then?" she asked. "Your father mentioned that the Jacobson place is for sale. The small spread that borders your north pasture." His eyes were intent on hers. "It's not much, 100 acres, a small cabin, some decent grazing land, but it's a start, something of my own to bring to our marriage." "You've discussed this with father," Colton nodded. "Last week. He thinks it's a sound investment. The price is fair, and the land could eventually be joined with the Rockinga to expand your herd." "Our herd," she corrected automatically, then smiled at the implication. "So you've been planning this for some time." "Since the night of the social," he admitted. "I've been saving most of my wages. It's not enough for the full purchase yet, but your father offered to hold the note for the remainder if I can make a substantial down payment." Violet was touched by the careful thought he'd given this, by his determination to come to their marriage as an equal. "The Jacobson place has good water," she observed, "and that stand of pine on the north ridge would provide building logs if you wanted to expand the cabin someday." "If we wanted to," he corrected gently. "It would be our decision, Violet, our home if you choose it." She looked at him in the flickering light, this man who had found her crying at a social and changed the course of her life. In his eyes, she saw everything she'd ever wanted but hadn't known to name: respect, partnership, a love that strengthened rather than diminished her. "When?" she asked simply. His smile was slow and sweet. "I can have the down payment by September. We could marry before winter sets in if that suits you." "It suits me very well," she replied, lifting her face for his kiss as thunder crashed overhead and rain drummed a joyful rhythm on the roof. The following weeks were filled with planning and preparation. Colton rode to the Jacobson place almost daily, assessing what repairs were needed, planning improvements, and learning the particulars of the land. Violet divided her time between her usual ranch duties and beginning to collect the household items they would need for their new home. Charles watched their preparations with approval, offering advice when asked, but mostly allowing them to make their own decisions. His back troubled him more frequently now, and he admitted privately to Violet that he was grateful for Colton's strength and knowledge. The ranch would be in good hands when the time came for him to step back. Word of the upcoming marriage spread quickly through Copper Creek and the surrounding ranches. Congratulations poured in, along with the inevitable wedding gifts, practical items mostly, suited to a ranching couple's needs. Mrs. Barlow from the livery organized a quilting bee, and the women of the community created a wedding quilt in blues and creams that matched Violet's eyes and complexion. By mid-August, Colton had completed the purchase of the Jacobson place and began the most urgent repairs to the cabin. Pedro and the other hands helped when they could be spared from the Rockinga, and neighbors pitched in as well, in the time-honored tradition of the West. The wedding was set for the third Saturday in September after the fall roundup, but before the winter weather made travel difficult for those coming from a distance. It would be held at the ranch, with the reception following in the main barn, cleared and decorated for the occasion. As the day approached, Violet found herself increasingly reflective. She thought often of her mother, wishing she could have known Colton, could have been present for this milestone. She wore her mother's pearls during the final fitting of her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation of ivory silk that Mrs. Peterson, the town's seamstress, had labored over for weeks. "You look beautiful, daughter," Charles said when she modeled the completed dress for him in the privacy of their home. "Your mother would be proud." "Do you think she would have approved of Colton? I mean," Charles considered this seriously. "Your mother was an excellent judge of character." "Better than me, truth be told." He smiled slightly. "She would have seen in Chase what I see: a man who loves you for exactly who you are, not who he wishes you might be. That's rare, Violet. Don't ever take it for granted." "I won't," she promised, embracing her father carefully to avoid wrinkling her dress. The day before the wedding dawned clear and crisp, with the first hint of autumn in the air. Tradition dictated that bride and groom should not see each other on the wedding day until the ceremony. So Colton had planned to spend this last night as a bachelor at their new home, completing final preparations before bringing Violet there as his wife. He came to the rocking in the late afternoon to say his temporary farewell. They walked together to the small rise behind the barn, where a stand of aspen trees provided privacy and a view of the distant mountains, now dusted with the first snow of the season. "Nervous?" he asked, noting her unusual quietness. "Not about marrying you," she replied honestly. "Perhaps a little about everything else, the ceremony, the guests, the move to a new home." "We don't have to leave the rocking right away," he reminded her. "Your father has made it clear we're welcome to stay until spring if you prefer." Violet shook her head. "No, I want us to begin as we mean to go on in our own home, making our own way." She smiled up at him. "Besides, I've grown rather fond of the Jacobson place, our place." "It won't be as comfortable as you're used to," he warned, not for the first time. "The cabin is small and winter comes early at that elevation." "I'm not afraid of hard work or simple living, Colton Chase. You should know that by now." He smiled, pulling her into his arms. "I do know it. It's one of the many reasons I love you." She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "This time tomorrow we'll be married." "Yes," he agreed, his voice deepening. "Husband and wife." The words sent a shiver of anticipation through her. They had been careful during their courtship, mindful of her reputation and their own principles. Kisses and embraces, yes, but always within the bounds of propriety. Tomorrow, everything would change. As if reading her thoughts, Colton tightened his arms around her. "I should go," he said reluctantly. "There's still much to do at the cabin, and if I stay much longer, your father might reconsider his blessing." Violet laughed, stepping back slightly but keeping hold of his hands. "One more day, Colton Chase, just one more day." "The longest of my life, I expect," he replied with a rueful smile. They walked back to the house hand in hand, savoring these last moments of their courtship. At the porch steps, he kissed her tenderly, then more deeply, a promise of things to come. "Until tomorrow, Miss Ainsley," he said as he finally released her. "Until tomorrow, Mr. Chase," she replied, watching as he mounted his horse and rode toward their future home, his figure straight and proud against the setting sun. That night, as Violet laid out her wedding clothes and completed the last of her packing, a profound sense of peace settled over her. Whatever challenges lay ahead, and there would be many, she knew they would face them together, as partners and equals. She thought briefly of the social where they had met, of the tears she had shed over Gerald Whitman's betrayal. What had seemed like an ending had proven to be a beginning, instead the first step on a path that had led her here, to the eve of a marriage founded on genuine love and mutual respect. With this comforting thought, she blew out her lamp and settled into her bed for the last time as Violet Ainsley. Tomorrow, she would become Violet Chase, and a new chapter of her life would begin. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, as if nature itself approved the union about to take place. Violet woke early, her stomach fluttering with excitement rather than nerves. Today, she would marry Colton Chase, the man who had found her crying at a social and changed her life forever. Mrs. Barlow and several other women from town arrived mid-morning to help with preparations. They bustled about, arranging flowers, setting up tables in the barn, and generally creating the cheerful chaos that precedes any significant celebration. In her room, Violet submitted to their ministration's hair arranged in an elegant knot with soft tendrils framing her face. Her mother's pearls fastened around her neck, the ivory silk dress carefully buttoned and adjusted to perfection. "You're the loveliest bride we've seen in Copper Creek in many a year," Mrs. Barlow declared, stepping back to admire the results of their work. "That young man of yours won't know what hit him." Violet smiled, her cheeks flushing with pleasure. "Thank you for everything. The dress, the quilt, all of it." "That's what community is for, dear," Mrs. Barlow replied, patting her hand. "Now, I believe your father is waiting to see you before the guests arrive." Charles Ainsley stood by the window in the front room, dressed in his best suit, his gray hair neatly combed. When he turned and saw his daughter in her bridal finery, emotion flooded his weathered face. "Violet," he said, his voice rough with feeling, "you're the image of your mother on our wedding day." "Oh, Father," she said, crossing to embrace him carefully, "I wish she could be here." "She is, in a way," he replied, clearing his throat, "in you, in this day, in the love you've found." He took her hands in his. "I want you to have something." From his pocket, he withdrew a small leather pouch. Opening it, he revealed a gold band set with a single modest diamond. "Your mother's wedding ring," he explained. "She always said it should be yours when the time came. I had it polished and sized to fit you." Tears filled Violet's eyes as she looked at this precious link to the mother she'd lost too young. "It's perfect," she whispered. "But Colton has already purchased a ring." "I spoke to him last week," Charles said with a small smile. "He agreed you should have this one instead. Said it was fitting that you carry a piece of your mother with you into your new life." This consideration, this sensitivity to family ties and traditions, was so characteristic of Colton that fresh tears threatened. "He's a good man, isn't he, Father?" "The best I know," Charles confirmed, echoing her own words from months before. "Now dry those eyes. Your groom will be here soon, and we can't have him thinking you're having second thoughts." Violet laughed, dabbing at her eyes with the handkerchief her father offered. "Not a chance of that. I've never been more certain of anything in my life." By early afternoon, the ranch yard was filled with buggies and wagons as guests arrived from town and neighboring ranches. The ceremony would take place beneath an arbor the men had constructed near the aspen grove, with chairs arranged in rows facing the mountains. Inside the barn, long tables had been set up for the feast to follow, decorated with wildflowers and ribbons in Violet's favorite blue. Colton arrived with Pedro and Lucas, who were serving as his groomsmen. He wore a new suit of dark blue, his hair neatly trimmed, his face freshly shaven. Several of the ranch wives commented on what a handsome couple they would make, the dark-haired bride and her blue-eyed groom. As the appointed hour approached, guests took their seats, and Reverend Thompson from the church in town took his place beneath the arbor. The small group of musicians, a fiddle, a guitar, and an accordion began to play as Pedro and Lucas escorted Charles's sister Martha, who had traveled from Kansas for the occasion, and Mrs. Barlow to their seats of honor in the front row. Then the music changed to a traditional wedding march, and the assembled guests rose, turning toward the house. Colton, standing beneath the arbor with Reverend Thompson, felt his heart nearly stop as Violet appeared on her father's arm. She was radiant in ivory silk, her dark hair gleaming in the autumn sunlight, her eyes seeking his immediately across the distance between them. As father and daughter made their slow progress down the makeshift aisle, Colton reflected on the journey that had brought him here, the years of wandering, the shadows of his past. The night he had found a crying woman at a social and followed an impulse to offer comfort. Never could he have imagined that simple act of kindness would lead to this moment, to this woman, to this future bright with promise. When Charles placed Violet's hand in his, Colton felt a profound sense of rightness settle over him. The Reverend's words washed over them, speaking of love and commitment, of partnership and faith, but Colton was focused entirely on Violet, on the trust and love shining in her eyes. They spoke their vows clearly, promising to love and honor each other all the days of their lives. When the time came for the ring, Colton gently slid her mother's gold band onto her finger, a perfect fit, a perfect symbol of past and future joined. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Thompson declared, beaming at the couple. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Chase." Colton needed no further invitation. Cradling Violet's face in his hands, he kissed her with a tenderness that made several of the women in the audience dab at their eyes. When they turned to face their friends and family as Mr. and Mrs. Chase, the applause was enthusiastic and heartfelt. The celebration that followed was everything a Western wedding should be: abundant food, lively music, dancing that continued well into the evening. Charles had spared no expense, providing the best whiskey for the men and sweet wine for the ladies. The ranch hands had constructed a dance floor in the barn, and guests of all ages took advantage of it, from children skipping in circles to elderly couples moving with the dignified grace of long practice. As twilight deepened into night, lanterns and candles transformed the barn into a warm haven of light and laughter. Violet and Colton moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and good wishes, sharing their joy with those who had come to celebrate with them. "Mrs. Chase," Colton murmured during a quiet moment when they had stepped outside for some air. "How does it sound?" "Wonderful," Violet replied, leaning against his shoulder. "Though I'll probably answer to Miss Ainsley for months out of habit." "You'll always be an Ainsley," he assured her, pressing a kiss to her temple. "That's part of who you are, part of what I love about you." She turned in his arms, facing him in the moonlight. "And what else do you love about me, Mr. Chase?" His smile was tender as he brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Your courage, your kindness, the way you can gentle a frightened horse with just your voice, the fact that you're as comfortable mending fence as you are baking bread." He kissed her softly. "The way you loved me enough to trust me with your heart after it had been broken." Violet's own heart swelled with emotion. "That was the easiest thing I've ever done," she confessed. "Loving you, as natural as breathing." They might have stood there longer, lost in each other, had Charles not appeared at the barn door. "There you are," he called. "People are asking for the bride and groom. It's time for the last dance before you head to your new home." Reluctantly, they returned to the celebration, accepting the good-natured teasing of their guests as they took the floor for a final waltz. As they moved to the music, Violet caught glimpses of familiar faces, her father watching with quiet pride, Pedro raising a glass in salute, Mrs. Barlow wiping away a sentimental tear. When the dance ended, there were cheers and well wishes as the newlyweds prepared to depart. Colton had readied the buckboard earlier, and now it waited, decorated with ribbons and loaded with wedding gifts and Violet's trunks. She changed quickly from her wedding dress to a practical traveling outfit, then embraced her father in a long, emotional farewell. Though their new home was only a few miles distant, this moment marked a fundamental change in their relationship. "Be happy, daughter," Charles said gruffly, his eyes suspiciously bright. "That's all I've ever wanted for you." "I will be," she promised, "and I'm not going far. We'll see you soon." With a final round of goodbyes, Colton helped Violet into the buckboard and took up the reins. As they drove away from the rocking, friends and family waved and called out good wishes, some of the younger men firing pistols into the air in celebration. The night was clear and crisp, stars blazing overhead as they traveled the familiar road toward their new home. Violet sat close to Colton, his arm around her shoulders, keeping her warm against the autumn chill. "Happy," he asked, looking down at her in the moonlight. Completely, she assured him, resting her head against his shoulder. And you, more than I ever thought possible. He pressed a kiss to her hair. I keep thinking about that night at the social. If I hadn't seen you crying, if I hadn't gone to you. I believe we would have found each other anyway, Violet said with quiet certainty. Some things are meant to be. As they crested the final hill, their new home came into view, the Jacobson cabin, now the Chase homestead, with lights burning welcomingly in the windows. Pedro and Lucas had ridden ahead to light the lamps and start the fire, ensuring the newlyweds would arrive to a warm house. Colton drew the horses to a halt before the cabin door. Before Violet could move, he set the brake and turned to her, taking her hands in his. I love you, Violet Chase, he said simply, his voice deep with emotion. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you. You already are, she replied, touching his face gently. You have been since the moment you found me crying and called me your own. He kissed her then under the vast canopy of stars, a kiss that spoke of beginnings rather than endings, of promises kept and a future built together. Then, with the tenderness that had first won her heart, Colton lifted Violet into his arms and carried her across the threshold of their home, into the life they would create together in this wild, beautiful land they both loved. Epilogue: 5 years later, the spring roundup at the Chase Ainsley ranch was in full swing, with cowboys moving across the expanded property gathering cattle for branding and sorting. From her position on the ridgeline, Violet could see the entire operation, the skilled riders cutting specific animals from the herd, the dust rising from hundreds of hooves, the chuck wagon positioned by the creek where the men would break for midday meal. Beside her, 4-year-old Charlotte sat proudly on her own pony, her dark hair in 2 neat braids, her blue eyes so like her father's wide with excitement as she watched the activity below. When can I help with the roundup, Mama? She asked, her small hands confident on the reins of the gentle mare Colton had selected especially for her. When you're a bit older, sweetheart, Violet replied, smiling at her daughter's eagerness. For now, you help by staying safe and learning to ride well. Papa says I'm the best rider he's ever seen for my age, Charlotte declared with the absolute confidence of childhood. Papa is absolutely right, Violet agreed, adjusting her hat against the bright morning sun. Speaking of Papa, let's go find him. I think he's by the North Corral with Grandfather. They rode down the gentle slope, Charlotte managing her pony with a skill that did indeed belie her young age. As they approached the branding area, Violet spotted her husband and father deep in conversation, likely discussing which heifers to keep for breeding and which to send to market. Charles Ainsley had aged in the past 5 years, his hair now completely white, his back more stooped. But his mind remained sharp, and he took enormous pleasure in teaching his granddaughter the ranching knowledge accumulated over a lifetime. Though he had officially turned the rocking over to Violet and Colton 3 years ago, moving into a comfortable suite of rooms built onto their expanded home, he remained actively involved in major decisions. Colton looked up as they approached, his face lighting with the smile that still made Violet's heart skip after 5 years of marriage. He excused himself from Charles and strode to meet them, lifting Charlotte from her saddle and swinging her high before setting her on his shoulders. "There are my favorite ladies," he declared, reaching for Violet's hand as she dismounted. "Come to check on our progress." Charlotte couldn't wait another minute to see the roundup, Violet explained, leaning in for a quick kiss. "And I wanted to tell you that Martha's awake from her nap. Rosa's bringing her down soon." At the mention of her baby sister, Charlotte bounced on her father's shoulders. "Can I show Martha the calves, Papa, please?" "If you're very careful and stay with Rosa," Colton agreed, glancing at Violet for confirmation. At her nod, he continued, "But no going near the branding fire or the cutting horses. Those are rules we don't break, remember?" "I remember," Charlotte promised solemnly. "I'll be the best big sister ever." As if on cue, Rosa appeared from the direction of the house, carrying 8-month-old Martha, whose golden curls and brown eyes were a blend of both parents' features. The baby squealed with delight at the sight of her father, pudgy arms reaching for him immediately. Colton settled Charlotte on the ground and took Martha from Rosa, bouncing her gently as she patted his face with curious hands. "There's my little cowgirl," he cooed, all traces of the hardened trail rider gone in the presence of his daughters. Charles joined them, moving slowly but steadily with the aid of the walking stick Colton had carved for him last winter. "The children should see the new foals," he suggested, taking Charlotte's small hand in his weathered one. "Rosa, would you accompany us to the mare's pasture? These old eyes could use your younger ones to keep watch." Rosa, the young woman who had joined their household when Martha was born to help with domestic duties, nodded her agreement. "Of course, Mr. Ainsley. I've packed a small basket of cookies and milk if the children get hungry." As the small party moved toward the pasture where the spring foals frolicked on spindly legs, Colton handed Martha back to Rosa and turned to Violet with a smile. "Alone at last," he murmured, drawing her into the shade of a nearby cottonwood tree. "Or as alone as we get these days." Violet laughed, settling comfortably against his chest as his arms encircled her. "Are you complaining, Mr. Chase?" "Not for a moment," he assured her, dropping a kiss on the top of her head. "Just appreciating a rare quiet moment with my beautiful wife." From their vantage point, they could see the progress of the roundup, the activity around the branding fire, and Charles leading Charlotte and Rosa toward the mare's pasture. Their world spread before them in the bright spring sunshine. "I received a letter from Gerald yesterday," Violet mentioned, feeling Colton's slight tensing at the name. "Penelope had their third child last month, another boy." "That's good news," Colton said neutrally. Though the years had softened any lingering awkwardness, Gerald Whitman's name still carried a certain weight between them, a reminder of what might have been, and how differently their lives could have unfolded. "He mentioned they might visit Copper Creek this summer," Violet continued. "His father's health is failing." Colton nodded thoughtfully. "We'll welcome them if they come. It's been a long time." "Yes," Violet agreed, thinking of how much had changed since that night at the social when Gerald had publicly humiliated her. The pain of that memory had faded to almost nothing, replaced by the fullness of the life she and Colton had built together. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as one of the newer hands successfully roped a particularly stubborn steer, earning cheers from his colleagues. "I've been thinking," Colton said finally, his voice taking on a tone Violet recognized as his serious business approach, "about expanding again. The Taylor property to the west is coming up for sale. Good water rights, excellent summer grazing." Violet considered this, mentally reviewing their finances and current operations. It would mean hiring more hands, and the initial investment would be significant. "True," he acknowledged, "but with cattle prices rising and our breeding program doing so well, I think it's a sound investment in our future, in the children's future." The easy way he included her in this decision, the natural assumption that her business judgment was as valuable as his, still warmed her heart after all these years. Their partnership was everything she had hoped for: equal, respectful, founded on mutual trust and shared goals. "Let's discuss it with Father at supper," she suggested. "Review the numbers together before making a decision." Colton nodded agreement, then his expression softened. Have I told you today how much I love you? Not since breakfast, she replied with a smile, turning in his arms to face him fully. I believe you were distracted by Charlotte's announcement that she intends to break the new Mustang herself. He laughed, the sound as rich and warming as it had been the first time she heard it. That daughter of ours has your determination and my stubbornness. Heaven help us when she's older. Heaven help the young men of Copper Creek, you mean, Violet corrected, raising an eyebrow. Though I suspect you'll be standing on the porch with a shotgun when they come calling. Damn right I will, he confirmed, only half joking. Then his expression grew more serious. Do you ever regret it, Violet, choosing me? This life? The question surprised her. Never, she said firmly, holding his gaze. Not for a single moment. Why would you ask that? He shrugged slightly. Just thinking about Gerald's letter, I suppose. The life you might have had in Denver. Fine houses, society parties, silk dresses instead of work boots and calloused hands. Violet shook her head, reaching up to touch his face gently. That was never the life I wanted, Colton. You know that. I belong here on this land with you and our children. This is where I'm happiest, where I'm most myself. The love in his eyes as he looked down at her was as powerful as it had been on their wedding day. How did I get so lucky? He wondered aloud. As I recall, she replied with a mischievous smile, you found me crying at a social, took me into your arms and called me your own. The rest, as they say, is history. The best kind of history, he murmured, lowering his lips to hers in a kiss that still held all the promise of their first. In the distance, Charlotte's delighted laughter rang out as a foal apparently did something amusing. Martha's babbling joined in, along with Charles's deeper chuckle. The sounds of their family, their legacy, carried on the spring breeze. As Colton and Violet walked hand in hand toward their loved ones, the ranch sprawling around them in all directions, they shared a look of quiet contentment. From unlikely beginnings, tears at a social dance, a stranger's kindness, they had built something enduring. A love strong enough to weather any storm, a partnership equal to any challenge, a family bound by genuine affection and shared purpose. And in the wild, beautiful West that had shaped them both, they had found not just each other, but their truest selves and their rightful home.